Hi, my dragons. Welcome to Psychology of Violence and Aggression. It is the first lecture of the intro. And welcome to my deck, where the majority of the video recordings take place, with me and my Dunkin' Donuts coffee, because America runs on dunks. Anyway, so we're going to cover the first intro PowerPoint, and I put a thing up on the portal for you for... on the Moodle, I should say, for a discussion, and we'll go from there. Okay, so on this first PowerPoint, which I will put up there, the first couple of things that are on there are video clips from Gandhi. And Gandhi, as you may know, was a Nobel laureate, peace activist, and he started out as a lawyer. Mohandas K. Gandhi. And they called him Mahatma, which means, a holy man in Hindi language from India. And he was on a train in South Africa, and South Africa is an interesting country. Like I said, I was there in March. And then COVID happened. The Rona came and took me out. Anyway, so he is really revered in South Africa because, he started the peace movement, which inspired Nelson Mandela, and then Nelson Mandela, which they call Mandiba, which is the same way of saying Mahatma Mandiba. So Nelson Mandela picked up the baton and ran with it after Gandhi. And I did go to the Apartheid Museum, which was very interesting. You can see the influence of Gandhi with Mandela, and I also did some really interesting stuff in South Africa that on the QT, on the DL, as you guys say, see, I can be cool, about how Nelson Mandela went forward with the anti-apartheid movement. So I started out with some video clips for you to watch, and it's about how Gandhi addressed violence and aggression. So I'd be interested in hearing what you thought about those clips. So anyway, so violence and aggression, pervasive everywhere. Insidious, persistent, pervasive, okay? And we find it everywhere. So I had you define, I think, on your, I don't know if I put that up yet. But anyway, what is your definition of violence and aggression? Because it's not the same for every person. Like everybody, some people might say, well, that was violent or that was aggressive, and that's not cool. Or some people might say, yeah, football is violent and aggressive, but, that's the nature of the sport, and that's cool. So we have a lot to discuss because as criminal justice majors, as any kind of major, you're going to encounter violence and aggression, but especially so as a CJ major because, it's just pervasive throughout our field. And there are different types of violence and aggression. I was just reading in the New York Times, last week's New York Times, a week behind, Sunday Times, where an inmate was, he was there on a burglary charge, so not really even a big charge, just a burglary charge, 3rd degree. And he was afraid of COVID, and how COVID has been rampant in prisons. And so he took his mask, which was supposed to protect him, and he hung himself with it. He killed himself. So there's also violence against others, violence against self, violence against society. We're going to talk about all of those different things. And mostly we're going to talk about our perceptions of violence, okay? Is this violent? Do you think this is violent? Is it aggressive? Why not? What are we going to do about it? So I also posted a lecture guide. So as I do the video, you can write and fill in, go along with me with the video, okay? The same thing the way we would do it in class, except you're on my deck. Good thing it's a big deck. Anyway, so I put the National Research Council panel definition up there. Behavior by persons against a person intentionally threatens, attempts, or actually inflicts physical harm. So the key word there is intention. So yes, you may say that hockey or football, hockey is my favorite sport. That's why it was my favorite team sport. That's why I was laughing, because what they say. I went to the fights and a hockey game broke out because it is somewhat violent. Okay, it is violent. Okay, but that's not an intentional violent. Okay, so the word intention is important in some situations. And we're going to talk about, like, well, yes, it's violent, but the intention was not to harm the other person. It was to score a goal or to, whatever, have my team win or whatever like that. I'm going to show you a really, when I get back to work, which hopefully will be next week. I test on Monday, so if the test comes back negative, I'm positive it will. Well, I'm hopeful it will. Then we'll have class in person on Thursday. So keep your fingers crossed that happens. If not, then we'll meet here again on my deck. But I'm going to show you a really bloody clip from sports, and then we'll discuss what we think of that. Was it violent and aggressive? Where the intent was really blurred, okay? Also, I put the Shaver and McCulsener definition of aggression up there on the PowerPoint. Behavior performed by someone with the intent of physically or psychologically harming, and that individual wants to avoid the harm, okay? So obviously this only applies to humans because, animal cruelty is a thing. There's violence and aggression there. Some may say that if you're a carnivore and you go to a slaughterhouse, that's aggression and violence. So there's all kinds of things that enter our collective experience, when we talk about these things. So, we're going to have good discussions, okay? So when we talk about violence, some people think that violence is just an extreme, especially destructive form of aggression. So maybe a great essay question on the exam is, tell me your definitions of violence and aggression. And what do you include and what do you exclude? And why? Okay? So that's really good. So sports sometimes legitimizes violence and aggression. Like, some people watch particular types of sports just for the violence and aggression because that is either cathartic and sometimes it induces them to be violent and aggressive. So we do things in sports that would be unacceptable anywhere else, that would be a battery or something like that anywhere else. And so we have to delineate those kinds of things. We see these kinds of court cases come up all the time with athletes, and we wonder why, because they're in violent sports, things like that. And ask yourself, is a violent sport more fun to watch or more fun to play than a non-violent sport? And we're going to talk about that, okay? So there you go. I have a PowerPoint on the other side, on the other computer, 2 computers, which is out of your vision. What about cartoons in media? Okay, how many of you watched cartoons as a kid growing up that were really violent? Okay, everybody always goes to, the Roadrunner. It was very violent. The Roadrunner was getting blown up every 2 minutes, Bugs Bunny and all of those kinds of very violent ones. One study found that once sport violence is legitimized, there's a tendency for athletes to be violent off the field as well. Because this is my thing, and I'm going to talk about this all the way through the class, that I think that people's criminal behavior is linked to their behavior that they're rewarded for. So people tend to repeat bad behavior that's rewarded. So if you are violent on the sports field and people cheer for you because you're violent, then that's a rewarded behavior and you're more likely to repeat it. That is my implicit theory of violence and aggression. I'm not saying that should be yours, or I'm not trying to push it on you or anything like that. That's my own theory. The National Coalition Against Violent Athletes found that male student athletes comprise 3.3% of the population, but represent 19% of the perps and 35% of domestic violence cases. So that is a statistic that is tough to argue with, okay? If you comprise 3.3% of the population, then one would expect that you comprise 3.3% of arrests and violence that we know about, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Also, what about corporate violence? My area of research is in toxic torts. And this is when corporations and industry do things that are harmful or violent. In the law, we call that willful and wanton negligence, okay? So if a company is, I don't know who would ever do this, but feeding a whole city bad water, polluted water, so that people in the city get sick because they want to do it to save money and increase their profit. I don't know who would do that. That's an example of corporate violence. Or polluting a river, or polluting a land, or destroying mountains, and things like that. So those are all toxic torts, and that's what I'm really interested in. So that's corporate violence and corporate aggression. And of course, you know, I'm going to talk about that a lot because that's my area of interest, okay? And some of those look at lawsuits against corporations and against executives in those corporations. And what about psychological violence? Psychological violence, a negative, persistent attribution to other people to cause them emotional distress. What about that kind of violence, okay? So that's really interesting to do. We have to delineate between criminal and non-criminal violence, okay? So if you're violent in the course of doing a sport, okay, and the violence is different than what it would be in normal life. So as we said already, violence in sports, it can be the same actual behavior, but since it's in the context of a sport, we kind of don't count that as criminal behavior. But a battery is a battery is a battery. So unwanted touching in the state of Ohio, any unwanted touching is considered a battery, okay? So for criminal, the thing that turns the threat, attempt, or use of physical force by one or more persons into criminal law, without the law, the violence would be outrageous or immoral or depressing, demoralizing, lamentable. But it's not a crime unless it is against the law, specifically, unless it violates the revised code of that particular state. So that's a really interesting sticking point, and that's a cases that have been made in court, actually, against athletes. In the consensus model, we are looking at what a society agrees upon in terms of violence and aggression. And that's very important because we are the people. We the people. We're the ones that govern our, we're the ones that make the laws. What is acceptable to all of us. And if you don't like a law, you fortunately live in a country where you can, you know, advocate to change the law, work to change the law. So that's really interesting. What do we say is right and what do we say is wrong? And then we codify this. All of our laws in the United States came from a whole bunch of ancient places, like the Code of Hammurabi and English law. And that's what the Pilgrims brought with them, and the British brought with them when we were their colony. Okay? So there's a little story in there about John Billings in Plymouth, which you should read as well. So we had a revolution in this country because we did not, as colonists, agree with what the British were saying should be the law of the land. So that's what started that. So the consensus model depends on whose consensus it is. Is it the consensus of the British or is it the consensus of the colonists? And so eventually the colonists got their way and had a revolution. The conflict model is the power is in the key of making law, okay? People with political and economic power tend to make laws that protect their interests. Wow, what a surprise. But then they use those laws to oppress the poor. And it's a cycle. So if you're using a law to oppress the poor, and so you keep the poor in substandard schools and don't give them good education and don't inform them of their rights and privileges, then they don't even realize that they can change the law if they want. So that is a very important distinction between rich and poor in this country and the conflict model. So white-collar crimes, environmental crimes, they often go out unpunished because either people think they're too boring or they're not important or it's not affecting them. There's a reason why big corporations will pollute in areas where low-income people live. Okay, there's a reason. We call that environmental racism. So again, that's part of the area that I'm really interested in is toxic tort. The environment can't fight back, but I think the environment is fighting back through wildfires, floods, and the Rona. I think the Mother Nature's getting a little fed up with us. So environmental pollution, all of that, those also fall into the conflict model. I'm going to stop this here, and then we'll go into part 2 in a minute. So I'll make another video in 1 second.